Well, let's talk about one of the largest Buicks ever made. In fact, perhaps the largest, and that is the 1975 as well as the 1976 Electra, effectively the same cars. We're going to look at some photos of a 1975 Electra, though, here and discuss them in greater detail. Now, by this point, most of you will know that the Electra was affectionately known as the so-called Deuce-N-A-Quarter because for a number of years, it was called the Electra 225. And where did the 225 come from? Well, back in the day, Electras were 225 inches in overall length, and that's where the Deuce-N-A-Quarter or 225 came from. Now, interestingly, by 1975, this Electra was far more than a Deuce-N-A-Quarter. In fact, this two-door coupe that you see here, along with the sedan, measured 233 inches in overall length, or about 8 inches more than what was required to be labeled a Deuce-N-A-Quarter. And in fact, the coupe and sedan were a little bit longer even than the Electra estate wagon, which was a little over 231 inches. So the station wagons were actually shorter than the coupes and sedans in these years for the Electra. 1975 was the penultimate year for this particular body style, and the Electra was refreshed versus the 1974 version, mainly out front where the headlights from the 1974 model, as well as the grille and the header panel, were changed out in favor of this 1975 model that went to the rectangular quad headlights as opposed to the round headlights from the 1974 model. And the headlights now are squished close together as opposed to spread out. And you have this kind of wall-to-wall grille theme with an egg crate texture and even a texture within a texture in that egg crate. Now, this particular 1975 Electra Limited, notice the Limited badge there on the driver's side, has a bug guard, too, up front. So, got to protect your investment if you're a Buick owner. Now, as I mentioned, this 1975 Electra was very long, and despite where it says there Electra 225 on this model, this is a lower-end custom Electra, and that's why it says the 225 there after Electra. It's, well, long, but it has this huge rear overhang, despite a relatively long wheelbase, too. And one of the things that I don't necessarily care for on these cars is that during this time frame, GM thought that they were going to have to implement pretty strict rollover standards in vehicles. And so a lot of the cars have this pretty pronounced B-pillar, just like the Electra does here. This was also the reason behind GM sunsetting convertibles after the 1976 model year. They thought that they couldn't produce them and meet the impending federal rollover standard, so they stopped production. Of course, that standard wasn't fully implemented, and convertibles would come back in the early 1980s. But during this time frame, you'll notice a lot of cars, including the full-sizers or the mid-sizers from GM, the so-called Colonnade cars, had much more prominent B-pillars for this reason. Now, the rear-end treatment on the 1975 Electra is one of the unfortunate elements of this car. Not necessarily unfortunate because of the styling, but because of these enormous rubber flubber fender end caps or quarter panel end caps that you can see there. Look at where that molding terminates on the body side, and then that area between that and the rear bumper. That from the factory was a flexible cap that was made out of a rubber compound and then painted. And the reason for that was this 5-mile-an-hour impact standard in the rear of the vehicles that was introduced in 1974. And in order to meet that impact standard, they had to have these squishy fender extensions on either side. And the Buick, as well as the Cadillac, had enormous fender extensions. The other divisions got away with things that didn't look quite like this, but the unfortunate part about it is if you own one of these cars today, those fender extensions weren't engineered to last for 50 years, and you're generally going to be forced to replace them if they haven't been already, and the replacement part quality is abysmal. So if you find a car and it's in perfect condition, but the fender extensions are not in good shape, hopefully budget, honestly, $3,000, maybe more, toward getting them repaired because they'll have to be fitted. And this is one of the reasons why I've admittedly sworn off of cars of this era that have those fender extensions, because it's just hard to get the right parts and they never quite look that right. So if you don't want the fender extension cars, get something in terms of your Buicks or most cars overall from 1973 or earlier. And in the spirit of the rear impact standard, notice the bumper has these rubber strips as well to help cushion the impact. I do like the reverse lights that are set up high. That was a Buick trait for a number of years, and I think it made the car look really good in the rear because those were not just reverse lights, but they were also driving lights. When you had the headlights or parking lights on, those would glow red, and then they would glow white in the event you put the car into reverse. Notice also that the tail lamp treatment here, that egg crate style, replicates what you saw in the front, although kind of rotated by 90 degrees. Now here's where the fun really comes in on the Electra, and that is on the interior. In particular, the custom interior I think is pretty sweet because it has this grandma sofa floral pattern cloth that is really over the top, kind of similar to what was introduced for 1974. And there aren't too many vehicles of the era that have something similar, although during this phase, I would say, in particular 1975, it seems like GM interior designers were just going wacky with interior fabrics. Cadillac had some really strange ones, in particular, again, for the 1975 model year. And yes, it was the 70s, and yes, there was quite a bit of tackiness, and that's just how things were, but it still just looks funny. And I guess it's one reason why you might want to buy the car today. This instrument panel was new for 1974, basically a carryover design for 1975. A tasteful 3-spoke steering wheel. Notice the climate control there's on the driver's side, where it should be, where the passenger cannot touch the climate control. The driver is in full control of what the temperature is in the car, and that I am in complete support of. I don't want the passenger messing with the overall car interior temperature. And here's a close-up of the instrument panel. Notice no gauges aside from the fuel gauge, a bunch of idiot lights instead. And this rather nice silver with black numbers painted on it speedometer. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is it appears that there are two speedometer needles. There's an orange one and a white one. The orange one is the actual speedometer needle, and then the white one is the speed alert that you could set to any particular speed, and then if you pass that speed, a buzzer would go off, and it was a really annoying buzzer. It kind of sounded like a wounded duck if you passed that particular speed. So that was an option. This car has it. You can also see the supersized Buick accelerator pedal down there on the floor. Buick had some pretty sweet accelerators. Oldsmobile, though, had, I think, ones that were a little bit larger a few years earlier. And here's a better view of the control for the speed alert. You see it says speed alert there, as well as the trip odometer set, or I should say reset, basically. So you rotate that, and that little white needle would move back and forth to whatever speed that you selected. This car also has the optional blower-style rear defogger, not defroster, the rear defogger with a low and high speed, basically just blew air over the back window. Somewhat effective, but not anything that's going to de-ice the rear window. Now we saw what the standard custom interior looked like. Here's the Electra Limited interior in cloth, a nice, I don't know what you would say, kind of crosshatch pattern there, somewhat loose cushion style design, at least halfway up the back. And I think it actually is more tasteful and less tacky than the custom interior. Both interiors, though, were quite comfortable, and I think owners were pleased with either. Now, as we look under hood, we have Buick's 455 cubic inch 4-barrel V8, and this would be the penultimate year for the 455. In 1976, that would be the last year, and then in 1977, Buick would no longer have a 455 cubic inch V8. The largest Buick engineered V8 in 1977 would be the 350 cubic inch V8. And if you wanted a larger V8 in your Buick Electra in 1977, you would get the Oldsmobile 403 cubic incher as the optional engine. So we're getting to the final years of big block power for Buick. And 1975 was also the first year that Buicks were painted blue under hood. They were normally painted red in prior years. GM was starting to go to a corporate blue engine paint across the entire lineup. I think presumably because they didn't want buyers to be able to discern what division was making their V8, because they knew in 1977 they were going to have different divisions making different engines for their vehicles under hood. And I suspect that's why the paint scheme changed. Now, you can tell this is a Buick V8 because the distributor is up front. You have 4 ports on the exhaust manifold, 1 for each cylinder. You also have the air conditioning and compressor, both on the passenger side. That was a unique feature for the Buick V8. So those are a couple ways to tell that you have a Buick V8 under hood. The valve covers on this car have obviously been detailed. That's not quite the right blue for this engine under hood, but oh well, I guess it's close enough. You'll see what the correct blue looks like here. Now, notice that this particular vehicle, or these Buicks, had this white plastic radiator shroud as well as the coolant and washer bottle. And that was a Buick exclusive. I don't know what they were trying to do there or why they felt that that was some competitive advantage versus other General Motors divisions, but only Buick had that white shroud as well as the bottles on either side. And, well, I guess Buick thought that it was necessary, and so it made it into the car. What didn't make it into the car, unfortunately, was a heck of a lot of horsepower, as by this point, 1975 was the first year for catalytic converters, and those considerably robbed horsepower in their early years. And the 1975 Electras with this 455 were making around 205 horsepower. A lot of the 455s from GM during this time were making, some of them even under 200 horsepower, like the Olds V8 and the Cadillac V8 as well when in carbureted form. And it's amazing to see these large engines, 455 cubic inches, 500 cubic inches, etc., that have all of a couple hundred horsepower. Now, they do have a good amount of torque, but the torque isn't as much as you would expect either. 345 pound-feet, around 345, 350 for most of these big block engines. And again, not all that great. They just were choked down pretty significantly because of emissions. And this is another reason why I tend to stick to classic vehicles from 1973 and before, let's say, because you don't necessarily have as much of the emissions power robbing as you do on cars of this generation, particularly if you go back into the late 1960s. But nonetheless, a very smooth V8, Buick V8's well made. Really the only issues that I can think of with Buick V8s are the water pumps. They have relatively small bolts that tend to snap off, an aluminum timing cover, which sucks if the bolt snaps off sometimes, and the oil pumps, in particular, if the owners didn't change the oil. There were some oil pump issues on the Buick V8s. But overall, very robust, reliable engines, and a great car, the 1975 Electra. Bigger than a Deuce-N-A-Quarter. Thanks for watching.